Okay, well, for a long time I researched Eastern Europe, East European politics. I studied how political parties developed in the aftermath of communist rule in the 1990s. In all of these countries, of course, the one-party system had gone away, and now there were many parties. And it takes real adjustment for societies and for individual people to learn to operate in a system like that when many more choices are on offer and when each of those choices is not perhaps yet very clearly articulated. The first founding elections, the first democratic elections in a lot of these countries were so interesting because the party leaders were inexperienced and the voters were inexperienced. I mean, they were as intelligent and as educated as we are, but they were bombarded by information from dozens of brand new political parties, many of whom had not yet fully articulated a clear ideological vision. So I've spent a long time studying that and what it takes to build successful political parties, and indeed what it takes to build successful consolidated democracies that care about human rights and that do all the good things that democracies tend to do. And I still do that work. But in recent years I've also broadened out a bit, and I've been eager to go beyond just one region, and now I have the luxury of doing that now that I've sort of established a good foundation in Eastern Europe. So I'm interested in international human rights and have done some research on that. My biggest current project is looking at U.S. foreign aid. So I'm looking at U.S. foreign policy and the money that we give abroad. And I look at that in the context of trying to understand what it means for a country to be generous internationally in its giving to other poorer countries. And I think generosity, when it comes to foreign aid, is sort of different than, in some ways, different from generosity on an individual level. It gets a lot more complicated. Who's giving the money, who's receiving the money? If one person is generous to another person, the relationship tends to be quite clear, and that's, and you can study it, but you can understand it quite well, perhaps. But when it comes to international politics, you have governments giving to governments, you have governments giving to non-governmental organizations, you have individual people giving to non-governmental organizations that give to non-governmental organizations that hand out, services to people, and it gets very complicated very quickly. And so most of my research is oriented toward the motive behind giving. So to what degree, when we give foreign aid, to what degree are we giving foreign aid because we want to help and we're willing to sacrifice something to help? Or on the other hand, to what degree are we giving money for instrumental reasons to sort of, encourage a country to move in a certain direction or to satisfy certain foreign policy priorities that we have? And that's not necessarily bad. In fact, one very useful thing is the whole idea of enlightened self-interest, that my giving money to you might also help me in some way. And if one country's foreign aid donations can also end up helping it, then presumably everybody gains, and and things are good. But it's not always that way. One of the main things I've looked into is gauging how generous the United States is. And a lot of Americans, and public opinion polls routinely show this, most Americans grossly overestimate the amount of money we give and the generosity that we have toward other countries. I think if you ask most Americans, they would assume that we're one of the most generous people on earth in our international giving, and it turns out that we're actually among the very least generous when measured in relation to the wealth that we have available. And obviously, the United States gives more money than any other country does, but that's because we are by far the largest economy on the face of the earth. We're one of the wealthiest countries on earth. We consume and enjoy about 22 to 25% of global wealth, even though we only have 5% of the world's population. So, of course we give more money than any other country, but if you take the money we give as a proportion of our annual GDP, the annual amount of goods and services that we produce in a given year as valued in dollars, what you find is that we give a much smaller share of our annual income and indeed of our accumulated wealth. We give a much smaller share than do most wealthy countries in the world. And so what I've done in my most recent research is to look into other sources of giving. So not just official foreign aid, which is what I've just been talking about, but also other things that we do. For example, the things that, ways in which we use the military to help other people. For example, the military's delivery logistically of relief supplies in an earthquake zone or after a tsunami or something. And also looked at private giving that we individual Americans make through charities, for example. And so when you add up all of those additional sources on top of the official foreign aid that the government gives, what you find is that we're still not all that generous. And that if you add up all the money that we give in official government aid, and then add to that all the money that we give in private donations, plus all the military-related activities that we undertake for economic welfare and disaster relief purposes, etc., add all that up, and still it's lower on a per capita basis than about half of the other wealthy countries on Earth give in only their government foreign aid alone. So you add up all of this, and we're still less generous than many countries are solely with their government giving. So why do I make this case? It's not that I'm trying to sort of tear us down and be unduly critical, but there's something very unattractive, I think, about somebody taking great pride in something that actually isn't true, right? And I sort of would like Americans to have a better sense of what we actually do. And if we choose to give relatively little, then that's fine, that's a choice we've made. But to give relatively little, but then sort of parade around the world as though we're the most generous people, really rankles abroad to people who know these kinds of things, and I think is sort of unethical.